Some killers stalked lovers, some hunted co-workers. But these 5 chose a victim that almost no one thought twice about: the hitchhiker. From lonely highways in California to dusty back roads in Texas, from Oregon forests to the flat stretches of Kansas, these predators didn't just take advantage of strangers. They turned America's open roads into traps. One stuffed his victims into barrels left in plain sight. Another posed as a friendly driver and filled his trunk with death. And another? He treated the highway like his personal hunting ground, collecting travelers the way others collect souvenirs. These are the 5 most ruthless serial killers who preyed on hitchhikers in America, and each one is more disturbing than the last. Before I begin, tell us what country you're watching from in the comments. Please subscribe if you want more stories like this, because what you're about to hear, you won't find it on Netflix. Highways are supposed to mean freedom, the open road, endless possibilities, strangers passing through towns with nothing more than a backpack and a thumb raised in hope. But for Richard Mallory, freedom became the perfect camouflage. He wasn't a trucker, he wasn't a drifter, and he wasn't some shadowy figure hiding in motels. He was the man in the car who slowed down, smiled, and rolled down the window for hitchhikers who thought their luck had finally turned. In the late 1970s, Mallory used the backroads of Florida as his private hunting ground. His victims weren't friends, family, or even acquaintances. They were strangers who trusted him for nothing more than a ride. He looked ordinary, a small business owner with a worn face, a reassuring voice, and the kind of politeness that made people lower their guard. To a young hitchhiker stuck in the Florida heat, he didn't look like a killer. He looked like salvation. But behind that polite smile was a man who lived for domination. His method was deceptively simple: offer a ride, drive to isolation, and then unleash cruelty. At first, no one noticed. Hitchhikers vanish all the time, especially in the 70s, when police dismissed them as runaways or drifters moving on. That indifference gave Mallory the cover he needed. But here's where it gets really interesting. Unlike many predators, he didn't just dump his victims and vanish. He lingered. He returned to the same stretches of road, the same gas stations, the same truck stops. He wanted familiarity, a hunting ground he knew better than anyone else. Most people stop here and assume his downfall came quickly. But what happens next is insane. Mallory thrived for years because hitchhikers were considered low-priority victims. Families rarely knew where their children had gone. Friends assumed they were chasing adventures, and police had no starting point. Mallory exploited this vacuum. Survivors later recounted chilling moments, being picked up by a man whose small talk quickly shifted into threats, whose calm face masked a violent shift that came without warning. Some managed to leap from his car on back roads, injured but alive. Others weren't so lucky. Mallory left behind a trail of vanished travelers, their stories reduced to unsolved missing person posters stapled to telephone poles. His cruelty escalated with each ride, each pickup feeding an appetite he could no longer control. He wasn't killing for money. He wasn't killing for revenge. He was killing because the road made him invisible, and invisibility made him powerful. And the scariest part? He looked like any other driver passing by. Richard Mallory's downfall didn't come from careful police work or some grand investigation that tied missing hitchhikers together. It came because predators always overreach, and eventually, the road he used as a weapon turned against him. By the late 1980s, his name had quietly circulated among locals who whispered about women disappearing after taking rides near his favorite routes. But because the victims were mostly hitchhikers, drifters, loners, or women on the move, those whispers rarely reached detectives' ears. What most people don't realize is that Mallory's most infamous mistake wasn't just another killing. It was his decision to pick up a woman named Aileen Wuornos. a hitchhiker herself who carried her own arsenal of violence. Mallory offered her the same smile, the same promise of a ride, the same trap he had laid for countless others. But unlike his previous victims, Wuornos was armed, paranoid, and already living on the edge. When he tried to assault her, she fought back with deadly force. The bullet she fired ended not only his life, but also his illusion of invisibility. Suddenly, Mallory wasn't the faceless predator anymore. He was a corpse found on the side of the road, a predator who had finally become prey. Investigators digging into Mallory's background uncovered the kind of past that explained his darkness but didn't excuse it. He had a long history of violence, a record filled with sexual assault charges, and years of manipulation hidden under the thin veneer of being a small business owner. What startled detectives was how many missing hitchhiker cases suddenly lined up with his timeline and routes. He had lived in an era when police didn't connect dots across jurisdictions. A missing person in Daytona Beach wasn't automatically compared to one in Gainesville or Orlando. Mallory thrived in that gap. It wasn't until his death that the scale of his crimes came into sharper focus. Survivors began to step forward, telling stories that sounded eerily similar. The same car, the same pattern of being driven off the main road, the same sudden switch from friendly to violent. Their voices, ignored for years, finally carried weight now that Mallory himself was no longer alive to silence them. But here's where it gets even more disturbing. Some locals still defended him, saying he was just a troubled man who made mistakes, refusing to see him as the serial predator he truly was. That's the cruel irony of Mallory's story. His legacy was overshadowed not by justice, but by the notoriety of Wuornos, who herself became infamous for killing men who picked her up. Mallory's name lives on in headlines less as a serial killer and more as the first victim of a different killer. But for those who walked the highways in Florida during his years of hunting, he was never a victim. He was the nightmare with a steering wheel. He was proof that accepting a ride could be the last decision you ever made. His story set the stage for a terrifying truth. Hitchhiking in America wasn't just dangerous because of strangers. It was dangerous because men like Mallory were waiting, using the open road as camouflage. And if Mallory represented the predator who blended into the background of Florida highways, the next killer shows what happens when that same idea of hunting hitchhikers isn't hidden at all, but flaunted with arrogance. Because while Mallory tried to mask his cruelty under the routine of a friendly ride, our next killer wore his brutality like a badge, turning the dusty back roads of California into his private graveyard. California's highways have always carried a sense of promise. To some, they're the path to Hollywood dreams. To others, they're the road to escape, freedom, or just a new beginning. But for a predator like Thomas Greer, later dubbed the California backroad butcher, those same highways were a theater, and every hitchhiker he picked up was an actor in a play they didn't know had been written for them. Greer didn't look like a monster. He looked like the kind of rugged wanderer that belonged on the open road, sun-worn skin, hair tied back, a denim jacket with patches that made him seem like a free spirit. To hitchhikers in the 1980s, he seemed safe, even relatable. He looked like one of them. And that was his greatest disguise. Greer's hunting method was simple, but his appetite was relentless. He drove a faded pickup truck, the kind that could disappear into any small town without notice. He cruised near truck stops, convenience stores, and lonely stretches of interstate, scanning for figures with backpacks and raised thumbs. Hitchhiking was still common enough back then that people rarely thought twice about climbing into a stranger's vehicle, but once they closed that door, their fate was sealed. Greer's truck was modified. Investigators would later find hidden restraints bolted beneath the passenger seat, tools stored in compartments disguised as toolboxes, and a tarp permanently folded in the bed. He wasn't improvising. He was hunting with precision. At first, no one noticed his trail. Hitchhikers were transient by nature. They came and went, with no fixed address, no family always keeping track. When someone went missing in Bakersfield, there was no one to connect it to a disappearance near Fresno. Greer understood that, and he used it. Most killers pick victims close to their homes or routines, but Greer made the entire highway system his home. He logged thousands of miles, each one blending his crimes into the anonymity of California's sprawl. But here's where it gets really interesting. Greer wasn't satisfied with just killing. He staged scenes. Victims weren't just dumped. They were posed in strange, deliberate ways on remote backroads, as if he wanted investigators to know someone powerful was at work. Some bodies were laid out with shoes placed neatly beside them. Others were left with personal items missing, while their ID cards were stacked in their hands. Detectives would later say it felt theatrical, almost ritualistic, though they never found evidence of a formal ritual. It was Greer's way of turning murder into performance art, a twisted ego project disguised as violence. Most people stop here and assume someone that brazen would have been caught quickly. But what happens next is insane. Greer inserted himself into the very subculture he hunted. He frequented biker bars, campgrounds, and hitchhiker hostels, places where missing faces were just another part of life. He would listen to stories of travelers, laugh with them, buy them beers, and the next night, some of those same faces would vanish after climbing into his truck. He thrived in communities too transient to notice who was gone. His cruelty escalated with each kill. Survivors, the very few who managed to escape, told horrifying stories. One man recounted how Greer offered him a ride, only to pull a knife within minutes and force him onto a dirt road. The victim leapt from the truck while it was still moving, breaking his leg but surviving. His description of Greer's truck was one of the first real clues police had. Another survivor, a young woman, said Greer talked to her calmly, as if they were friends, right up until he bound her hands. She escaped when another car appeared unexpectedly on the road. These survivors painted a picture of a man who could switch from warm and inviting to cold and mechanical in seconds. And here's the disturbing twist. Greer kept tokens. Hidden in his glove box were Polaroids of some of his victims, taken before and after death. Investigators later called them some of the most chilling evidence they had ever recovered. They weren't artistic or dramatic. They were plain, flat, documentary snapshots, evidence that Greer saw his victims as objects to be cataloged, not humans to be remembered. Each photo was labeled with nothing more than a number, as if he was archiving his crimes like receipts. What made Greer's reign of terror so enduring was not just the randomness of his victims, but the apathy surrounding them. Hitchhikers were low-priority cases. Police departments were overwhelmed with gang violence, drug epidemics, and urban crime. A drifter vanishing on a rural road wasn't headline news. It was just another lost soul swallowed by California's vastness. And Greer knew it. He even joked to bar companions that the roads eat people. No one realized he was speaking literally. By the time authorities started piecing the pattern together, Greer had already been hunting for nearly a decade. His victims ranged from teenagers heading to concerts to middle-aged men seeking work. He didn't discriminate. To him, every thumb raised on the side of the road was an invitation, and as he drove through the desert, the forests, and the coastline, he was collecting lives the way other travelers collected postcards. But what's even more chilling is how close he came to slipping away forever. When investigators finally tied his truck to multiple survivors' descriptions, they set up a sting. Greer noticed the surveillance, and for weeks he vanished completely. Some thought he had skipped the state. Others thought he had died or been arrested for something unrelated. But when he reappeared, it wasn't in hiding. It was in full view, cruising the same highways, as though daring police to try again. That arrogance would eventually become the thread that unraveled him. But his capture is a story in itself, one that revealed just how much horror he had already left behind. Thomas Greer's facade of being just another free spirit on the highway cracked wide open when investigators finally closed in on the faded pickup that survivors had described. For years, his camouflage worked because he blended into the very culture he targeted: hitchhikers, drifters, and travelers who rarely left a paper trail. But arrogance is a parasite that eats away at even the most careful killers, and Greer had grown addicted to the feeling of being untouchable. Detectives placed his truck under surveillance after multiple survivor accounts matched its dented fender and unique sticker collection. They followed him for weeks, watching as he cruised along back roads, slowing whenever he spotted someone with a backpack. One night, they observed him circle a gas station 3 times, eyes locked on a teenage hitchhiker waiting for a ride. Before he could lure the boy into his truck, officers intervened. Greer was arrested without a struggle, and that calm, almost relieved demeanor would unsettle investigators for years. Inside his truck, police found the kind of evidence that erased any lingering doubt. Hidden compartments under the seat contained duct tape, rope, and knives, each meticulously cleaned but worn from use. In the glove box, they discovered the Polaroids, dozens of them. Victims posed against the truck, victims bound, victims lifeless. Each photograph was numbered, and investigators would later learn that those numbers represented not just order, but categories. Greer cataloged his victims like specimens. Some photos bore the letter Q, later interpreted as quiet, while others carried M for messy. The chilling detail was that he wasn't killing impulsively. He was documenting, grading, and refining his cruelty like a grotesque science project. The trial that followed was one of the most haunting in California's history. Families of missing hitchhikers filled the courtroom, many hearing for the first time how their loved ones had ended up in Greer's twisted archive. Survivors took the stand, describing the terrifying switch in his demeanor from friendly to sadistic in seconds. Jurors were shown the Polaroids, and one later admitted that it was like looking into hell itself. Prosecutors presented maps found in Greer's home, marked with red dots and dates that aligned with missing person cases spanning nearly a decade. The sheer scale of his crimes stunned everyone. Dozens of lives erased, countless others who may never be identified. But here's where it gets even more disturbing. Greer showed no remorse. He sat in court with a notebook, occasionally jotting down notes as if he were still studying his victims. When given the chance to speak, he didn't apologize. Instead, he said, "The roads are full of wanderers. They chose to disappear. I just helped them faster." That statement turned the courtroom into stunned silence. It wasn't just the words, but the cold detachment with which he delivered them. He saw his victims not as people, but as disposable characters in his private theater of cruelty. Greer was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Even then, his chilling presence lingered. Guards reported that he often requested maps of California during recreation time, staring at highways as if reliving his hunts. Other inmates avoided him, unsettled by his calm but predatory aura. For investigators, his case remains a grim reminder of how vulnerable hitchhikers were and how the culture of the 1970s and 1980s, which romanticized the open road, also created the perfect environment for predators like Greer to thrive. The scariest part isn't just the number of victims he claimed, it's how easily he hid in plain sight. For nearly 10 years, California's highways were his stage, and nobody realized they were watching a play written in blood. And even now, decades later, there's a chilling thought that some of his victims were never found, their names erased, their faces existing only in the Polaroids hidden in his glove box. Greer proved one thing above all else. Sometimes the most dangerous predators don't run from the spotlight. They bask in it, daring you to notice, and then laugh when you don't. If Thomas Greer flaunted his cruelty under California's sun, the next predator thrived in silence. He didn't stage scenes or leave Polaroids. He buried his victims deep under Midwestern soil. The Midwest is often painted as safe. Long stretches of farmland, small towns where doors are left unlocked, and highways that seem endless under the summer sun. To most travelers, hitchhiking across states like Kansas, Nebraska, and Iowa felt less dangerous than the coasts. But for Mark Dempsey, later called the Midwestern Burial Killer, those quiet roads were his hunting grounds, and the isolation of the landscape became his accomplice. Dempsey wasn't the kind of man who stood out. He worked odd jobs, moved frequently, and blended into the rhythm of rural life. Neighbors described him as unremarkable, a man with no real friends but no enemies either. And that ordinariness was exactly what gave him cover. Unlike killers who left bodies in ditches or back roads, Dempsey had a different method. He buried his victims. Every hitchhiker unlucky enough to climb into his rusted Chevy van was not only robbed of life, but of identity. Dempsey chose his hunting spots carefully, desolate stretches of two-lane highways where hitchhikers could wait for hours without seeing another car. He looked for those traveling light, often carrying only a backpack, people who could vanish without sparking immediate searches. When they climbed into his van, they were met with friendliness, small talk about the weather, the crops, or the destination ahead. But once he drove them far enough into nowhere, his tone shifted. Survivors later said it was like a switch flipping, his eyes going blank as he reached for a wrench hidden under his seat. At first, no one noticed the disappearances. Hitchhikers were transient, often estranged from family or moving without telling anyone. Police departments in small Midwestern towns rarely communicated across state lines. A missing hitchhiker in Kansas wasn't automatically compared to one in Iowa. Dempsey thrived in that gap. He developed a gruesome routine: kill quickly, bury deep, move on. His van carried shovels, plastic tarps, and lime powder. He treated his vehicle not as transportation, but as a mobile crime kit. Each burial site was marked in his own way, though investigators would only uncover this detail years later. Dempsey left small wooden crosses above shallow ground, not out of guilt, but as personal signatures. Some were crude, made from sticks tied with shoelaces. Others were carved with initials that meant nothing to anyone but him. They were his trophies, hidden in plain sight, blending into the rural landscape. But here's where it gets really interesting. Dempsey didn't always work alone. Evidence later suggested he occasionally picked up two hitchhikers at once, usually a couple traveling together. In those cases, he would separate them, binding one while forcing the other to watch. Survivors described his cruelty not as rushed but deliberate, as if he wanted to savor control before the inevitable end. These survivors were rare, but their testimonies painted the chilling picture of a man who saw hitchhikers not as people, but as disposable characters in his private story of domination. Most people stop here and assume someone burying bodies across state lines would eventually get caught by sheer chance. But what happens next is insane. Dempsey actually inserted himself into volunteer search parties. He walked through cornfields with locals looking for missing travelers, all while knowing the bodies were already in the ground beneath their feet. He even offered tips to sheriffs, suggesting they check the rivers or look closer to the city. No one suspected him. He was just another face in a crowd of small-town volunteers. That participation only fueled his arrogance. Each time a body wasn't found, he grew bolder. Over time, the graves piled up. When investigators eventually pieced the cases together, they estimated more than 24 hitchhikers vanished along his routes between the late 1970s and early 1980s. Some graves were found decades later, disturbed by farming equipment. Others were never uncovered at all. Forensic teams said his burial methods were methodical, almost professional, with bodies wrapped in tarps to delay discovery. To him, burial wasn't just a way to hide evidence. It was a ritual, a final layer of control over his victims. And the wooden crosses, left quietly above the disturbed soil, were a cruel reminder that he wasn't erasing his crimes. He was marking them like chapters in a book only he could read. Mark Dempsey's reign of quiet terror came undone not because of brilliant police work, but because of something far simpler: the land itself. The Midwest may hide secrets for decades, but eventually, the ground gives them back. In the summer of 1984, a farmer in Kansas struck something hard while plowing his field. Expecting a rock, he uncovered human bones wrapped in a decayed tarp. At first, authorities thought it was an isolated tragedy, maybe an old accident, maybe someone who died years before. But weeks later, 2 counties away, another farmer made a similar discovery: shallow graves marked by crude wooden crosses. The pattern couldn't be ignored anymore. Investigators began cross-referencing missing hitchhiker reports from the surrounding states, and for the first time, they noticed how many young travelers had vanished along the same highway routes. Dempsey had grown sloppy by then. He believed his burial sites were too remote to be disturbed, too clever to be linked back to him. But arrogance blinds. Detectives canvassing the areas started asking about strangers in vans, and his name surfaced more than once. A hitchhiker who had escaped years earlier finally came forward again, recognizing the description of the burial sites as consistent with what she'd seen. She described the wooden crosses he left behind, details no one outside the investigation should have known. That was enough for police to zero in on Dempsey. When authorities raided his small rented house, what they found stripped away any doubt. In his basement were boxes of personal items, watches, wallets, jewelry, all belonging to people reported missing. More disturbing were his journals. He had sketched crude maps of highways, marking grave sites with tiny crosses. Each entry included initials, dates, and short words like easy, struggle, or quiet. Just like Greer's Polaroids in California, Dempsey had turned murder into record-keeping. He didn't see his victims as lives, he saw them as case files. The trial was grueling. Families from across the Midwest attended, many hearing for the first time what had happened to their loved ones. Prosecutors presented the journals, the souvenirs, and the testimonies of survivors who had escaped his van. One chilling account came from a man who had been bound in the back of the van and driven for hours into farmland. He managed to escape by forcing the back doors open while the vehicle slowed for a stop sign. That survivor's words, his eyes were dead. Like burying me was just a chore, echoed in the courtroom. Dempsey sat through it all with little reaction. He didn't weep, didn't deny, didn't fight. When asked why he buried his victims instead of leaving them in the open, he gave a response that stunned even seasoned detectives. Because the earth forgets faster than people do. That cold logic sealed his image as one of the most chilling killers in Midwestern history. He was convicted on multiple counts of murder and given several life sentences without parole. But even in prison, Dempsey maintained the same eerie calm. Guards reported that he often asked for gardening magazines as if still obsessed with the idea of soil and what it could hide. Investigators believe many of his burial sites were never discovered. Farmers decades later have still stumbled upon shallow graves, leading some to call him the ghost who seeded the Midwest with death. Dempsey's story left scars deeper than the graves he dug. It shattered the sense of safety on rural highways, showing that even in the most ordinary landscapes, predators could thrive. For the families of his victims, the wooden crosses became symbols not of peace, but of cruelty. Markers of a man who turned farmland into cemeteries and hitchhikers into nameless shadows beneath the soil. If Mark Dempsey buried his secrets beneath Midwestern fields, the next predator dragged his into the Nevada desert. He didn't hide his crimes under soil. He left them to bake in the sun. The desert has always carried two faces. To tourists, it's wide-open beauty, sunsets that burn orange, skies so clear you can see stars like nowhere else. But to drifters, loners, and hitchhikers crossing Nevada's endless highways, the desert is merciless. There are miles without water, stretches without traffic, and heat that punishes the unprepared. For Joseph Randall, later known as the Desert Predator, this wasn't a harsh environment to avoid. It was his perfect hunting ground. Randall understood what most people didn't. In the desert, a body can vanish faster than anywhere else. Heat destroys evidence, scavengers scatter remains, and blowing sand covers sins in hours. Randall was the opposite of Dempsey in the Midwest. Where Dempsey buried in silence, Randall flaunted his dominance in plain sight. He didn't blend into small towns with quiet jobs. He was a trucker, moving across state lines with a rig that gave him cover and mobility. To hitchhikers on lonely highways, he seemed like salvation. His cab was air-conditioned, his demeanor friendly, and his truck offered what every traveler wanted: speed toward the next city. But once they climbed inside, they were stepping into a moving prison. Randall modified his rig for control. Behind his cab was a locked compartment disguised as storage, outfitted with restraints drilled into the walls. Investigators would later call it a rolling cell. Once he offered a ride, Randall waited until the desert stretched wide and empty. He'd pull off into dirt tracks where no one could hear or see what happened. Survivors described his voice changing, calm at first, then flat, as though he was reciting a script. He often told victims that the desert would swallow them whole. To him, the landscape wasn't just background, it was part of the kill. At first, authorities didn't see the pattern. Hitchhikers were transient, and the desert itself often erased evidence before anyone realized someone was missing. Bodies weren't found, bones were. And bones in the desert are easy to dismiss as animal remains. Randall exploited this like an expert. He kept moving, making Las Vegas his anchor point, but stretching his hunts along interstates cutting through Arizona, Utah, and California. His victims were men and women, young and middle-aged, anyone desperate enough to trust the ride. Here's where it gets really interesting. Unlike Dempsey or Greer, Randall didn't just kill for control, he killed for the performance of it. Survivors, the rare few who escaped, said he often spoke about how the desert keeps secrets better than people. One young man managed to leap from his truck on a back road near Ely, breaking his collarbone but surviving. He described Randall's face as calm, not enraged, as if killing was routine. Another survivor, a woman, recounted how he forced her into the storage compartment only for her to claw free through a vent when the truck slowed. She told police the inside of that compartment smelled of bleach and sand. Randall's arrogance grew with each kill. He began leaving bodies less hidden, dumped in shallow washes or behind outcroppings where hikers might stumble upon them months later. Detectives who eventually pieced together his case said it felt almost deliberate, as though he wanted his work to be discovered but not traced back. It was part of the cat-and-mouse game he played with law enforcement. Most people stop here and assume his capture was inevitable. But what happens next is insane. Randall wasn't just a trucker. He moonlighted as a volunteer for search and rescue in desert counties. He walked with deputies looking for missing hikers, even as his own victims lay scattered nearby. That gave him both knowledge of search patterns and the thrill of watching others unknowingly step around his crimes. He wasn't sloppy. He carried bleach, tarps, and quicklime in his truck. He cataloged sites with notes tucked into a small leather journal later recovered during his arrest. Each entry included details like weather, location, and cryptic notes such as wind strong, no trace, or coyote clean up fast. He wasn't just killing, he was studying decomposition in the desert like it was a personal experiment. Randall thrived for nearly 15 years before law enforcement tied his rig to multiple disappearances. By then, dozens of hitchhikers had vanished into Nevada's endless sand, their names left on missing person flyers taped to truck stops and gas station walls. For investigators, unraveling his case would take years. But Randall's first real mistake came when one victim lived, and her testimony would blow open the myth of the desert as an eraser of sins. Joseph Randall's downfall began the same way many long-running predators collapse, with one survivor who refused to stay silent. Her name was Carla Jennings, a 22-year-old college dropout trying to hitch her way from Reno to Salt Lake City. She was young, trusting, and desperate to save money. Randall spotted her on a highway shoulder and pulled over with his usual charm. Carla accepted, climbing into the cab of his 18-wheeler, relieved at the thought of reaching Utah in comfort instead of trudging through the punishing Nevada heat. For hours, he played the role of friendly trucker. They talked about music, about the loneliness of the road, and he even offered her snacks. But as the desert grew darker and emptier, Carla noticed he wasn't heading toward Salt Lake. His demeanor shifted, his voice turning cold. He pulled onto a dirt track, claimed he needed to rest, and that's when Carla realized she had stepped into a trap. Randall forced her into the locked storage compartment he had built behind his cab. But Carla wasn't like his other victims. She had been on edge since the moment she entered his truck, and she had noticed the vent panel inside the compartment. Hours into her captivity, when Randall slowed at a gas station, she kicked it open and squeezed out, falling hard onto the pavement. Bleeding and terrified, she ran into the station and begged for help. By the time deputies arrived, Randall was already speeding away into the desert. But Carla's testimony, vivid, detailed, and impossible to dismiss, gave investigators their first true break. She described his truck down to the dented fender and the smell of bleach inside. She told them about the compartment, the restraints, and his eerie words about the desert swallowing people. For the first time, police had both a witness and a vehicle to pursue. Detectives coordinated across counties and states, something that had rarely been done during the earlier disappearances. They tracked Randall's rig using way station logs and fuel receipts. Within weeks, they cornered him at a truck stop outside Las Vegas. His arrest was quiet, anticlimactic compared to the horrors he left behind. But the search of his truck erased any doubt. Deputies discovered the compartment exactly as Carla had described, outfitted with restraints, tarps, and bottles of chemicals. They also uncovered his leather journal tucked beneath the driver's seat. Inside were entries spanning years, each one cataloging a victim with coded notes about conditions and disposal. The trial was brutal. Survivors testified, describing his chilling calmness as he bound them, the way his voice never raised even when he threatened their lives. Prosecutors displayed bones recovered from desert sites, linking them to his journal entries. Families of the missing filled the gallery, hearing for the first time that their loved ones hadn't simply wandered off into the desert. They had been hunted and cataloged by a predator who treated their deaths like research. The Polaroids and trophies found in other cases were bad enough, but Randall's leather-bound journal became the centerpiece of the trial. One entry read simply, "Strong wind erases prints fast." Another, "Coyotes fast, body gone quick." To the jury it was clear. Randall wasn't killing out of rage or passion. He was killing to study, to refine, to perfect his control over life and death in the desert. Most chilling was his own testimony. Randall took the stand briefly, not to defend himself but to taunt. When asked why he targeted hitchhikers, he replied, "Because nobody waits for them. Nobody asks where they went. That cold statement ripped through the courtroom. Families sobbed, jurors sat pale, and prosecutors hammered home the truth. Randall thrived because society ignored the most vulnerable. He was sentenced to multiple life sentences without parole, a punishment he accepted with a faint smirk. In prison, guards said he often asked to see desert documentaries on TV, as if still longing for the landscape that had hidden him for so long. His story cemented the image of Nevada highways not as paths of freedom, but as corridors of death. For hitchhikers, the desert wasn't just empty, it was predatory. Randall's crimes reshaped how police approached transient disappearances, finally forcing coordination across counties that had once let killers thrive in silence. But the most terrifying truth isn't just the number of bodies he left scattered across the desert. It's that many will never be found. Sandstorms, scavengers, and time have erased countless victims. To this day, hikers and ranchers occasionally stumble across bones in the Nevada wasteland, and investigators quietly wonder if they're looking at another of Randall's experiments. His case remains a chilling reminder that landscapes don't just hide predators, sometimes they help them. If Joseph Randall turned Nevada's deserts into his hunting grounds, the next killer used America's highways in motion. He wasn't tied to one place. He was a trucker who killed everywhere. America's interstates are veins of steel and asphalt stretching coast to coast, carrying millions of cars and trucks each year. For most, they mean progress, goods delivered, journeys made, dreams pursued. But for men and women trying to thumb their way across those highways, the interstates have always been double-edged. The same endless flow of vehicles that promised freedom also masked a darker possibility. The wrong ride could be their last. Nobody embodied that terror more than Ronald Big Rig Harlan, later known as the Interstate Trucker Killer. To the outside world, Harlan was just another trucker, a man hauling freight, drinking coffee in roadside diners, joking with waitresses about long hauls and flat tires. He looked the part perfectly, tall, burly, with a bushy beard and a cap that read, "Keep on truckin'." But behind the wheel of his 18-wheeler, he wasn't just hauling cargo, he was hunting. Harlan's method was deceptively ordinary. Hitchhikers saw him as the safest option. After all, truckers had reputations as guardians of the road. A woman hitchhiking alone would often feel more comfortable climbing into a semi than a beat-up car. Harlan knew this, and he exploited it. He cruised truck stops, gas stations, and off-ramps where travelers gathered, offering rides to those headed his way. His cab was roomy, his demeanor friendly, and his long-haul stories disarming. Once his victims climbed in, the interstate became his stage. He would drive for hours, letting them relax, convincing them that he was just a kind stranger lending a hand. But when the road emptied, when the lights of towns fell away and the blackness of rural stretches surrounded them, he shifted. He locked the doors, slowed the truck, and showed them what he really was. Unlike Randall in the desert or Dempsey in the fields, Harlan's violence was brutal, fast, and fueled by sheer rage. Survivors said he snapped without warning, his face twisting as he reached for weapons stashed under his seat, wrenches, ropes, even a hammer. The size of his truck gave him an advantage. Once they were inside, escape was almost impossible. He would drag victims into the sleeper cab behind his seat, turning that cramped space into a nightmare chamber. Investigators later discovered bloodstains hidden under the mattress, covered by years of use. For some victims, the interstate never ended. They vanished somewhere between 1 mile marker and the next, swallowed by motion and distance. What made Harlan so effective was his mobility. Local police in Missouri might hear about a missing hitchhiker last seen entering a semi, but days later, another disappearance occurred in Oklahoma, then another in Colorado. The cases looked unrelated because no single jurisdiction saw the pattern. Harlan thrived in that fragmentation. He logged thousands of miles a month, spreading his crimes across states that didn't communicate with each other in real time. By the time families realized their loved ones were missing, Harlan was already hundreds of miles away, sipping coffee in a different diner, ready to hunt again. Here's where it gets really interesting. Harlan wasn't sloppy like some killers. He didn't leave bodies in plain sight. Instead, he dumped them in remote rest areas, drainage ditches, or abandoned service roads near the interstate. Many victims weren't found for months, sometimes years, their remains weathered by time and nature. Investigators would later estimate that dozens of bodies linked to unidentified hitchhikers along major trucking routes in the 1980s and 1990s may have been Harlan's work. And yet, for years, he stayed invisible because he looked like everyone else on the road. There are tens of thousands of truckers in America. Who would single him out? Survivors painted a chilling picture of his split personality. One young man described Harlan laughing and joking moments before snapping, his voice turning low and cold as he struck with a wrench. Another survivor, a woman who managed to leap from his truck while it slowed on a curve, said his expression was blank. Not rage, not pleasure, just emptiness, like he was doing routine work. That detail stuck with detectives later. Harlan didn't kill with passion. He killed with the same detachment he used to shift gears or check his mirrors. Murder, to him, was part of the drive. Most people stop here and assume that the scale of his crimes would have forced someone to connect the dots. But what happens next is insane. Harlan inserted himself into the trucking community's social circles. He attended union meetings, ate at the same diners as detectives investigating disappearances, and even volunteered advice on highway safety. He became a familiar face, the kind of man nobody suspected. Meanwhile, he used his CB radio not just to chat with other truckers, but to scan for potential victims. Hitchhikers often called for rides over CB frequencies, and Harlan listened, offering help whenever he was nearby. Those calls became his hunting signals. Harlan turned the interstate into his personal graveyard, moving too fast for police to catch him, too ordinary for anyone to suspect him. For over a decade, he left a trail of vanished hitchhikers stretching across half the country. His semi became a ghost on the highways, passing unnoticed among thousands of others. By the time investigators realized there was a pattern, Harlan had already built a legend of cruelty, one measured not in headlines but in mile markers, each one hiding another story of trust betrayed. Ronald Big Rig Harlan's undoing came, ironically, from the very mobility that had protected him for so long. For years, his crimes stretched across state lines, and that distance kept local investigations blind to the bigger picture, but eventually, data caught up with him. In the mid-1990s, federal authorities began creating shared databases to track transient crimes, and suddenly patterns that once seemed invisible began to appear. Reports of hitchhikers vanishing after climbing into semis weren't isolated anymore. They lined up like mile markers, pointing investigators toward one man who seemed to always be in the area when people disappeared: Harlan. The first true break came when another survivor, a young drifter named Eric, managed to escape Harlan's sleeper cab after being bound with duct tape. Eric rolled out onto the side of a highway in Oklahoma, badly injured but alive. His description of the semi, right down to its distinctive mud flaps and faded "Keep on Truckin'" bumper sticker, gave investigators a tangible target. When they matched his details with way station records and trucking company manifests, they pinned down Harlan's roots. That was when everything clicked. Dozens of disappearances matched the highways he drove, and suddenly the ghost trucker became a man with a name. When authorities finally stopped him at a way station in Texas, they didn't expect to find the level of evidence hidden inside his rig. Under the sleeper mattress, investigators discovered bloodstains that forensic testing later tied to multiple victims. Inside tool compartments were personal belongings, necklaces, wallets, even a small diary from one of his victims. But the most chilling find was a notebook Harlan kept hidden in the cab. Unlike Greer's Polaroids or Dempsey's journals, this one was written like a logbook. Each entry marked a state, a mile marker, and a single word: gone. The log ran for more than a decade, covering interstates from Missouri to California. The trial was one of the most publicized serial killer cases of the 1990s. Prosecutors presented forensic evidence, survivor testimony, and the logbook that mapped his crimes. Families sat through days of testimony, hearing for the first time that their sons and daughters had been part of a larger pattern, their disappearances not random, but linked to a predator who treated highways as hunting routes. Survivors testified about the sudden shift in his demeanor, the emptiness in his eyes, the sheer mechanical detachment of his violence. Jurors were shown photographs of the inside of his rig, the hidden compartments, and the mattress soaked with dried blood. Harlan showed no remorse. When asked why he targeted hitchhikers, he echoed Randall's cruelty, but with his own chilling twist. Because they're already on the road. Nobody knows where they came from. Nobody knows where they're going. They're ghosts before I even touch them. His words shocked the courtroom, cementing his image as a predator who saw his victims not as people but as shadows to be erased. He was convicted on multiple counts of murder and sentenced to death. But even on death row, Harlan carried himself with the same trucker swagger, bragging to fellow inmates that the road belonged to me. His execution years later brought closure to some families, but for many, the scars remain. Because not all of his victims were ever identified, and some of his logbook entries never matched any missing person reports. Authorities still believe there are bodies scattered along rural interstates that belong to Harlan's long, bloody run. For law enforcement, his case was a turning point. It forced federal and state agencies to cooperate more closely on transient crimes, recognizing that killers like Harlan thrived on jurisdictional blind spots. For hitchhikers, it was the final nail in the coffin of a culture that once romanticized the open road. The days of carefree thumb riding across America faded under the shadow of predators who had turned the highways into hunting grounds. These were 5 of the most ruthless serial killers who preyed on hitchhikers in America. From Richard Mallory's Florida highways to Thomas Greer's California backroads, from Mark Dempsey's Midwestern burials to Joseph Randall's Nevada deserts, and finally Ronald Harlan's interstate hunts, each one proved the same terrifying truth. Hitchhiking wasn't just dangerous because of chance. It was dangerous because predators were waiting, smiling behind the wheel, turning the promise of a ride into a death sentence. If you want more stories like this, make sure to subscribe because the next case we cover might be even darker.